Good day. Welcome to the Strong Ambition Podcast. I'm your host, Rhyland Qually, and I'm going to dive into powerlifting today with Nada. Nada is currently my powerlifting and physical therapist coach online, and she's already helped me. Like, I can feel some heavy power in my lifts in so many different ways by actually working less intense. So it's super cool. And we're going to talk about how she educated me on intensity. She is both a powerlifting coach and a physical therapist. And the best part of her story that you'll find out her numbers. She is crazy strong. The strongest woman I've ever come to know. So, she's going to tell her story, how she got into it. And you're also going to hear about her strength numbers, which is really cool. And there's a ton of education here around, lifting intensities and taking that into context. So without further ado, here is Nada. Good day, Nada. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm quite swell, thank you. I'm super pumped to have you on, as it's just really cool for me, as you're currently my coach, and I've learned a lot already. I mean, I was just doing my bench press yesterday, and I'd never thrown up that kind of weight so fast and solid. So super pumped to have you on here. Why don't we dive right into this? Because I'm really big on knowing someone's story. And I'm super fascinated with you because of even how I ended up, signing up for your program. I mean, I legitimately just looked at your Instagram and I was like, oh my goodness, this woman is so strong. So why don't you tell people, introduce yourself, tell listeners about how you kind of got into both training, strength training, and physical therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of like strength training, I mean, I've always done kind of like strength training for my sports. Like I've always done sports since I was a kid. Got into really everything, and just strength training was always part of my main training. And so generally, like I've always been, I guess, like you say, like more on the stronger side compared to like my teammates. My endurance sucked, but like my strength was always up there. And it wasn't until I was a bit of sick of sports. At that time, I was doing pole vaulting, so I was kind of bored with the routine of going in, doing kind of similar things. And so I was looking into how I can like diversify, and that's where I got to know like CrossFit. And so obviously like strength training took a bigger portion of kind of my training. And then from there, I was starting to apply for, well, it was the year before I was going to apply for my master's. So I was thinking, okay, like I can't just like write, I just go to the gym. So I was like, I want to say like I've competed in this, won this, whatever, something to just put on my applications. And so at that point I was like, okay, I'll compete in powerlifting and Olympic weightlifting and see how it goes. And then from there, it just took off. Like the first meet that I did, I broke some of the Canadian records. And then just from there, I was like, okay, I'll just kind of do both. I'll do CrossFit and then just compete in powerlifting. And after a bit of time, I was like, I'll just kind of stick with the powerlifting side of things just so I could optimize as much as I can. Weightlifting, as much as I love it actually more than powerlifting, I have like a shoulder issue that's just never really gotten fixed. So I I guess like I didn't like really put too much effort into it because I was doing well in powerlifting. So I was like, I'm already doing well here. So it wasn't really affecting anything other than my jerks. So I was like, you know what, I'll just kind of stick with powerlifting. And I've been doing that now for about 4 years of, primarily just powerlifting.
I really like how you glazed over setting records. Just like, so, I just set some records and then kind of decided I guess I'm doing pretty good in this. I just around. And I just think that's really cool. And I actually even want to take a step backwards because I'm always super interested in the development of an individual from like childhood and stuff. So you had said some sports. I was very similar, strength based, and anything that was running or cardio, like a nightmare to me. What were some of the sports that you're actually involved in, and how do you feel that actually kind of helped your discipline within what you're now doing?
Yeah, so I mean, I did everything. So I did basketball, track and field, and there I specialize in pole vaulting. I did karate. I did, I don't know if you consider this a sport, speedball. I did swimming.
Sorry, what's speedball?
I don't know if it has other names, but it's that kind of like the ball that's just attached to a string that's attached to a pole.
Oh, yes. Yeah. That's a competitive, like there's actually like events for that? Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's crazy.
One reference to that with like Napoleon Dynamite and the very last scene where he just dominates the girl. Yeah, I can. Yes. Yeah, I didn't know that was people. No, that's great. And like even you saying karate and track, like the thing I think is super cool about hearing all this is what people don't recognize is like when you have a diversity of sports, you develop way better as an athlete. But if you stay very specific to a sport, you will have a good youthful experience in that sport, and then you will not develop as well as a long-term athlete. So like hearing things like like for sure track, it's just like so many different athletics that you require. And then when like you say like a martial art like karate, well your rotary ability, like your ability to stabilize and rotate and generate force is so substantial in comparison to other sports that are much more linear. So I think that's super cool. And then was there anyone that kind of stood out for you like that, like this is starting to really work as a passion for you?
I mean, pole vaulting definitely for sure, because I was doing that for a couple of years. I was pretty competitive in it. So in Egypt, like definitely a lot less opportunities compared to here. So I remember my first pole that I was using was a really long, old pole that had broken off from the bottom, and we were just kind of using a tennis ball at the bottom there. So it was pretty rudimentary, but like going through that and getting good enough that the club invested into like an actual pole. It was definitely a passion because I did that for a couple of years. But I think, being still like I was still a kid and going through that for a couple of years and doing kind of the same things over and over, I got that passion slightly over time kind of died out. And I was just like looking for something new, something a bit more varied. And that's really just the definition of CrossFit. So that's kind of how I found that.
Yeah, CrossFit is actually, it took me a while to recognize what it is, but to me, it's people who love training and want a discipline around training, because you'd see some people who were like okay athletes. Like I remember seeing a guy who was really just like he played university football and stuff like that. But then I actually asked some of the guys who played football with him. The guy was jacked. The guy was actually the Manitoba champ of CrossFit, and like chisel body. I'm like, hey, he must be a great football player. And it's like, no, he just likes to work out. And that's actually what makes that sport effective. Is like if you have the discipline and will to do a bunch of cleans and to carry this and just hustle your ass off in the gym, make it a sport. And that's really what CrossFit did very well. So did you feel like that really started to captivate you, started to help you really fuel your ambition? And around what age was this?
So at that point in time, I was, so I came to Canada in grade 11. That was kind of around the time that I started. So that around like, I think I was 15, 16.
Where did you originally grow up?
So for the first, for the first 15 years, I was in Egypt, but I was here in Canada actually when I was like way younger in grade 1 for 2 years, and then we went back. So yeah, so like, I mean, I think let's touch on one thing that you mentioned there is like that aspect of doing a lot of sports. Like one sport that I wish that I could have had the opportunity to do is like gymnastics, because I think that's one of the sports that definitely, as long as like, it depends on how hardcore you are with it with the kids in the beginning, because it can get quite hardcore, but just like getting them in to learn the basics, I think sets you up really, really nicely for any sport you decide to do later on.
Totally agree. My mom always said that was her biggest regret with me. She went because actually when I was like, I don't know, 1 or 2 years old, maybe three, I was climbing the chandelier in our dining room because it's just like my body was built for
Yeah.
like when you have more of that muscular build, it's like it's great to do things that are strength and athletic. And that's like you said, that's gymnastics. And that will totally set the foundation for any athlete. So I completely agree. I would love to get my kids into something like that. Now, so you're in CrossFit, teen turning into adulthood. And then like, I'm trying to pick apart this story because you glazed over into like, hey, I'm just breaking records. And so when you kind of made that transition, how long were you actually in CrossFit first off? And like, did that really set that strength foundation for you really well?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of already had the strength foundation to begin with, but it was definitely because the shift of like more focus, I guess, on strength training compared to like sports in general, that definitely gave a bump to my kind of my strength base as well. But I was in CrossFit for about, I think three to 4 years, I think, before I kind of got into like the powerlifting side of things.
Right. And I would just love to know your opinion from being in it because I haven't actually done any CrossFit actual like workouts, and for the exact reason that you already have the issue is shoulders. Like I would casually do snatches for trap development, but then like I can only do that for a month, and then I'm
Yeah.
like, no more cleans, no more snatches. So I'm curious from your experience, what do you like about CrossFit and what do you not like about it?
Um, I mean, just from like so are you referring to more like me personally, or like as in like movements, or like as a sport itself?
Bit of both. Like, just want to hear your feedback from it because I haven't like experienced it. I have
Yeah.
like a outside perspective, so I would love to hear like an inner perspective.
Yeah, I mean, like, so a big part of, a big part of CrossFit is both like the cardiovascular endurance and then the muscular endurance. And those definitely like to get used to something like that, and especially at a higher intensity, is quite difficult. And that's because that's one of the aspects I already struggled with in any sport that I did. That really was highlighted in CrossFit. But the funny thing is like, because they are like a bit shorter workouts, so you're dying for 10 minutes, but then once you're like slightly recovered after a couple of minutes, you're like, oh, I like want to go again. It's a very weird thing that I can't explain, but like I've never had that with a run where I'm like, I do a run and then I'm like, I stop. I'm like, yeah, I want to go for another run. That's never happened. But with CrossFit, it's like I'm dying, but then like I finish, I'm like, oh, I like actually want to go again. So so that was the fun piece to it. And I think what I liked about it is that there was so much to work on. There's way too many skills, like, and that's kind of part of why it's hard, but also it keeps things interesting because you've always got something to improve on. Compared to like powerlifting, where you're going in, you've got three main lifts and obviously like a bunch of accessories, but for the most part, it's very similar things that you're doing. But with CrossFit, you've got like infinite things you can work on. So training can always stay interesting, I think. The one thing that I guess, like, just from I guess one thing that I like and then one thing that I don't like about the sport in general is like, obviously like the good thing is like it's gotten a lot of people active. I think the fun aspect of it, like it being more, more quick, more varied, as well as like more of a community, like a big part of CrossFit is the community aspect. So you're going in, with your class, like typically it's the same class that you go in with on a, daily basis. So you build up that community. And I think that has gotten a lot of people active and a lot of people strength training. So I know a lot of people, like group classes and they go to those like at, conventional gyms, but not a lot of that is like strength training, which is, definitely missed out on. And I think that is done really well in CrossFit. The only aspect that I don't really like is, there's a lot of complex movements that for someone that's just beginning with a group of like 20, and one coach, it can be quite difficult to teach those complex movements quite well, and in a safe manner. And then you're also requiring those people to do those movements in a fast pace, right? So in a WOD or whatnot. So that's the only aspect of it that I don't agree with, is that kind of not enough supervision with like very complex movements, and in a very fast pace.
I completely agree. I would actually argue, give myself like kind of this idea that I actually was doing WOD style workouts. I was at times like, but it would not like I would not be okay with the closest thing is a dumbbell clean, and I knew people were kind of doing it like barbells. No, that's just too dangerous to me, and it takes so much direction to have a one-on-one with someone and trying to explain even a high pull, let alone a clean or a snatch. Like it's like it takes like reps and reps and reps because it's a skill. It is so much more of a skill, and especially if people don't have any intuition on how to drive their hips into these. A kettlebell swing takes skill. And so when you're going to do that barbell and then, okay, let's do the WOD, that was the biggest thing is like for Gen Pop to go into that is like a routine, super dangerous. But when you have the WOD style of, okay, let's do strength endurance, let's do reps and be out of breath. Like there's, like you said, something really efficient. And there's something, and this is, I think, really big in training and high intensity interval training and sport too, but it's not sport, but it has the same adrenaline rush of sport. So when you're at like high intensity intervals, you're at this, 80 to 90% of your heart rate max, like Orange Theory and all these places do well, is because we get an adrenaline rush because that's what you're doing. You're stimulating your fight or flight so much. And then when you say you come down from it, this is exactly what I deal with boxers, because I'm trying to get them to work optimal power. And I'm like, okay, calm down. She's like, no, I'm good to go. No, you're not. You're actually going to start coming down. And so with that like whole feeling of once you recouped and you caught your breath, you get tied to that adrenaline rush, not to mention just in general public assumes that if you're breathing heavy, you're burning more calories, which isn't inherently wrong, but it's not drastic enough that you always need to chase that feeling. So I'm totally on board with that. Now, when you're going from CrossFit into more of the powerlifting, let's actually distinguish the two here for people. So powerlifting, squat, bench, and dead. Weightlifting, Olympic weightlifting is the snatch, clean, and jerk, which I think you may or may not agree with this. Super ironic because they should be the opposite names, right?
Yeah, it's always gotten me.
Yeah, it's so people understand like power is force times velocity. So when someone's at Olympic weightlifting, they have the heaviest weight they can for the best speed, and that is the actual definition of power, speed and power. And then, but when you're doing weightlifting, it's just force, like force production. So it's super ironic because you're not actually producing raw power. You actually produce the most power with weightlifting. But so you got what was your favorite actually out of all the Olympic lifts? I'm actually quite curious.
So I love the snatch. It's a lot more technical. Like obviously the clean is still like clean and jerk is still technical. But like there is more of a strength, you could call a strength aspect to the clean. As well as obviously the jerk aspect, which I couldn't do because of my shoulder issue. So the snatch was like my groove.
Yeah. I found, because I didn't do it necessarily for the pure raw development of it. But it was like the best trap exercise for me, whether it was a clean or even a high pull or like, and I just assume it's from that eccentric force that you get from like when you're actually the initial concentric for sure. But when you're trying to actually like just try to load it at the base, it's going to have that eccentric force. And I just theorize that that's like how often do you see men or women with giant traps in CrossFit?
All the time.
All the time. Like, I don't think you can do that sport without traps. So, I mean, that kind of goes a little bit of case in point there. But so you develop into more powerlifting. And I'm super interested in this because, like I say, you just glazed over this, like hitting records. Did that happen just kind of, I don't want to say more or less easy, but it didn't sound, the way you described it, it didn't sound like a challenge. It sounds like, you know what, I was good at this. and then I just chased these records.
Yeah, I mean, I like going in. Again, it was more like, I guess low key when I went. Like I just kind of wanted to compete just to get something done. Like whether it was like just win the competition or like get some sort of official thing to put on the books, kind of thing. And I looked at the numbers. I was like, oh, like I'm there, so I'll go for it. And I can't remember exactly which records I broke then, but I think it was both for the deadlift and bench press, as well as the total. I want to say I can't remember for sure. This was a couple of years ago, but I think initially just the numbers just were slightly easier to get. I was also starting as a junior, so like a lower age, and a lot of people that do get into powerlifting, especially at that younger age, are people who are potentially just starting out with just lifting. Like, some people have obviously done some sports along the way as well, but I think just from like the general kind of theme that I've seen throughout kind of the competitors that I've seen throughout the competitions, it's people who typically have just started lifting for the actual sport of powerlifting, or have done like maybe some, general workouts at a conventional gym before, just like your typical kind of like beginner strength training stuff. So that's why I think like with the younger ages, I think the numbers are more feasible, you could say, to get the records. So that's why I think when I started, the number was like pretty doable. But when you get into the open age, which I think goes from like 23 and above, then you're looking at substantial numbers that do require you to be like up there.
Yeah, it makes sense when you're looking, especially on like the Canadian scale, and you say junior level. It's totally normal within boxing, for example. Someone be like, "Oh yeah, he was a provincial champ." Well, that was probably two other fighters. There's just it's not a huge tournament, Manitoba, or unless you're talking about like Montreal, which has like that many more fighters, but even then there might only been 2 or 3 fights. And are we talking novice, or are we talking open? Very similarly. So when you hear these titles, sometimes like I like that you put that into context, because you're in a niche sport, right? It's like you're not getting the best athletes in these niche sports. And there's only like not that many people in Canada in general. So it makes sense. I mean, it's still an accomplishment. It's still something to be like, hey, you know what? I did this, and we're not necessarily talking about a world population here, but it's still something to appreciate. But so then now you're more into the open. Have you set any records, or are you still competing very well at the open level? And what is compared to like international records?
Yeah. So this last tournament that I did, nationals, that was my first competition as an open. Unfortunately, I was going in with a back injury, so that wasn't the greatest. But I did end up setting a deadlift Canadian record. If I was hitting my normal numbers for everything else, like I could have set for the bench and total as well, which is what I'm hoping to do for next year. But yeah, like I think this is part of like powerlifting. I say this all the time, is like really the people who last the longest in the sport are the people who do the best. Like a lot of people, and I've been kind of guilty of this like previously, is you always look at these numbers and you're like, yeah, like I it seems doable, right? But you don't realize like where you're starting, and typically have like pretty quick gains in the beginning, and then like things slow off. But a lot of people push way too hard, way too soon, and you get injured a lot. And so the people who can last the longest without having injuries and just being consistent and having like that small progression over time are the people that will do the best in the sport. Because think of an injury that takes you out for like 3 to 6 months, and that's 3 to 6 months that, sure, maybe if you were only getting like 5 or 10 pounds in those like 3 to 6 months on each lift, that's still way more significant than actually not having any progress at all because you're, trying to just rehab this thing for that amount of time, right? So I always say, like, if you're able to like just be consistent and just progress slowly, injuries will happen regardless. Like, we can't really just prevent injuries, but we try to reduce them by doing what we know like will potentially cause injuries.
I love that you really brought that point up, like the play the long game. And this is like the biggest issue I see with the Gen Pop powerlifter, right? The Gen Pop strength trainer, or anyone that's trying to train really that doesn't have a coach and doesn't explain to them, hey, like, we just can't rush these results, and when you're messing around with heavy, like especially just physiologically dangerous loads, like it's one thing if you're talking about kind of those basic standards of, hey, if you can bench press your body weight, if you can do 1.5 your body weight, if you can deadlift 1.5 your body weight, you're doing good. Those are like, yes, like those are actually pretty simple health standards. But when you're talking bench pressing twice your body weight, when you're talking about deadlifting 3 times your body weight, like these things are, and I say physiologically because there's just structures in the body that can't really support that unless it's perfectly done. And I think this goes really good in one of the questions I wanted to talk about, which was like, how hard to train. And this is something you've even really kind of educated me a ton on, was recognizing RPE and versus percentages. So to quickly describe that for listeners is like RPE is a system from powerlifters that is rate of perceived exertion, or it's the inverse of how many reps you have in the tank, right? So if I say you use 6 out of 10 quite common at the start of a phase, reps in the tank. And I used to use percentages, like let's test for your 4 rep max and we'll go off that. But I'm really curious about this because this is something I still actually struggle with, is what is that 6 out of 10 RPE? And like, how do you know that you're at it? How do you know that it's like, oh, that was actually like an 8 or a 9? Or was that even a 6? Maybe could I have done more? So I'm curious, how do you get people to recognize their RPE and why you prefer that over percentages?
Yeah, so I mean, percentages are still definitely a good way to go. Like, there's only a couple things that make RPE potentially better in some situations. So if we look at RPE, the reason it's used is, your preparation on a daily basis is going to be different, and what that means is, just think of a time that you went into the gym and you just felt like shit, right? and another time you went in and you're feeling pretty good. And percentages don't take that into account. So what your body is able to handle on the day of, that's kind of how prepared you are for that session. And if, people tend to think of their 1 rep max as this thing that moves along with them every day. So they're like, yeah, my 1 rep max is, for the, deadlift is 300 pounds. And they just assume that that's what it is on a daily basis because it's what they hit before. So they just assume, okay, like that's my 1 rep max, right? Maybe it was your 1 rep max the day you hit it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every day you go in right now, you're going to be able to hit that 300-pound deadlift, right? And that's why that RPE is kind of used, because on a daily basis, that's going to change how prepared you are. Sometimes, and a lot of things factor into this, whether it's like your work stress, how much food you've had, how hydrated you are, all sorts of things factor into that, like how much sleep you've, had the night before. So many things that go into that. And so RPE just kind of says, okay, like, we want to be working at this specific intensity, right? So we want to be having, like you said, like that RPE 6 is like, I always want to have that 4 reps in the tank. You can potentially convert the RPE into like a percentage to get a sense of, like, that's when we're programming, that's what you have in mind, right? You want to be able to potentially hit this kind of around that percentage, right? So you can convert that. Like if you did like, 200 pounds, it's, RPE 6, you're able to get a percentage of what that actually is in terms of like your 1 rep max. So you get an idea of like, today, oh, like my theoretical 1 rep max was this, for example. So it's interconnected with the percentage. It just takes into account that fatigue level. Because let's say you are using your percentage based kind of system, and you go in, it's just not your day that day, and you're trying to hit 80% for like threes or whatever, and that at that day, because you're so fatigued or whatever is going on, that 80% is actually maybe around like 87%, and that's the actual intensity of it. Sure, as a number, it's the 80% of your theoretical one or your actual 1 rep max that you've hit before. But theoretically, that specific day, your strength levels were less, so now you're actually hitting way higher of a percentage, and now you're just inching closer to that, to that like inching closer to like they call them blanking out right now. To failure, that's the word. And so, not that working to failure is an issue, but if you have that on a constant basis and you're constantly hitting, and that's why we don't actually prescribe high percentages all the time. Like we're not having someone go lift at 90% every session, because then you just like way overwork them, right? The body would just not be able to handle that. So that just kind of, that's what RPE does. It just takes into account those aspects. There is obviously a lot. It's not a perfect system either, right? So it takes time to learn what actual RPEs are. So like I said, like how do you even know that this RPE was a 6? It can be difficult to know that for a while, for actually a long while, because but the beauty of it is it doesn't make a huge difference if you're like, 1 or above or below, because you're still working within that same percentage. Like a 1, and it depends on like the numbers that we're talking about, but it could be anywhere from like a 2.5% up or down. So it's not that huge of a difference, right? Like if you were to go hit, like you're supposed to hit like 80%, but you hit like 82.5%, like it's not that huge of a difference, right? And so it doesn't have to be like perfectly like an RPE 6 or RPE 7 or whatever you're going for, but it just needs to be around there. And there's been research done that the people are actually pretty good at telling their RPs, within that one mark, right? So, and that gets more, that gets better. Their judgment gets better. The closer they are, or the less reps there are. So like, if you're doing like a 3 reps at an RP 7 or whatever, your judgment is much better than like, a set of 8, for example. Just because like you're going pretty heavy, you aren't having that metabolic stress factor in too much. You're not getting that mental stress come in as well. So that doesn't factor in as much. It's more so actually like how does the weight actually feel for you? And people are pretty good at that. One way that I can, like, if someone's really struggling with it, one way that I like to do is just have them do an AMRAP, because then you could actually get a good sense of like what that actually is. So, if someone's really struggling, I've had maybe a couple people that have really just struggled to like hit, good RPs, and you could see it in their videos as well. Like when you have someone take a video of their lifts, and you're like, yeah, this is just either way too light or you're definitely going way too heavy because the bar is like barely moving. It's an RPE 6 supposedly. So one way that I do with that is like give someone a specific number to hit, let's say 200 pounds, and just go for an AMRAP. And typically you want something that they'll do for less than 10 reps, just so that you can actually get a sense of like a closer, like goes back to that judgment that we talked about. You also don't want to like just have them super fatigued for their upcoming sessions as well. So something that they can do for like less than 10 reps. And there's no specific percentage that you would typically go for. It's just something that makes sense, right, for the person and their situation. So you have them do that 200 pound, just go for an AMRAP. Absolute failure, you want them to actually, potentially even fail on their last rep. And then you get a sense of, okay, like for them, they understand that now that's what a 10 RP feels like. And they, supposedly they should also understand what a 9 RP feels like, or an 8 RP, because they kind of went through those and know that, okay, like at this point I've reached, this type of fatigue, and I was only able to do 2 more. So they get a sense, and like you do it more than once, obviously, because especially if someone's like really struggling with this, just so that they can collect that data for themselves and understand it more as well.
I really like that testing idea, and I think that's why I liked the 5-3-1 so much, which, just so people know, it's a percentage-based one, and because it gives you one big shot. And to me, it is a testing way, because I've seen so many people go through the 5-3-1 based on, 5-3-1 is supposed to be a 3-rep max percentage breakdown, but from the gym I was at, we always did 4-rep because it's that much safer. And all of a sudden you get these averages, and it's like, okay, so if they're in week 1, they should be in this rep range. And if you're not, like when you had said that RPE like description to me the first time, I was like, that makes a lot of sense, because RPE is perceived exertion, and your 3-rep max or 4-rep max is going to change every day. And that even takes me back to when I was trying to get over my old plateaus on the bench. This is years ago. And every day I had this Monday shift where it was Sunday, basically right into Monday, because I worked really late, barely any sleep. First thing in the morning, try to go work out. And I just, no matter what, I couldn't get over this bench plateau. And it's like, well, you just had a 2-hour nap. And so it's like, yeah, that's going to affect your performance because you're just not recovered. And so like, I really love that context. Now, the thing I also found really interesting was like, I think for like the powerlifting and the skill development, like that's something I've been preaching for so long. But I think what you've taught me really well in this is with the 5-3-1, you get 1, maybe 2, like depending on the variation, because there's also the, last set, first set, you could do joker sets and all this other stuff. But what's really effective, is it's efficient, you do that 1 big set. But when you say to me, okay, I want you to do a 6 out of 10 RPE or 7 out of 10, but all of your sets are there. Like there's more time under tension with a heavy load in practice. And like, you always have to use this term practice a lot, as you'd even said from the start about, the powerlifting is just doing the same shit and trying to get more and more efficient at it. Yeah. Right. And under that load. And so like with you helping me with the cues of like, hey, you got to brace here, you got to have this load here. And it didn't matter if I used to be able to muscle up my sumo deadlift and my conventional deadlift way more. Like if you broke down, it's like, yeah, well, all of these are just you're not firing off your muscles right. And it's, the thing is you can get so far with poor technique, and eventually the joints are going to like just give out. And that's what you're always trying to play with, because like, when it comes down to it, when you're doing a competitive sport, this is a Stan Efferding quote, you want to be healthy, you don't compete. But if you do compete, try to be as healthy as you can so your body doesn't break down. And it's a classic mistake with bench press, right? How many people have wide elbows? It's like, okay, lower your weight, bring in your elbows. And then you start getting them braced and all these other cues, like humble yourself because you're not really good at it. If you look at other sports, this is way easier to say, you're just going too intense because you can't do the movement. Like a hockey player can't stick handle if he has stiff hands. A boxer won't be able to slip a punch or to move well if he's not relaxed and smooth. And so the athleticism is a very evident thing in the sport of powerlifting, especially from a general public's approach, where I just want to be a strong guy. But you got to no, you're working on a skill. Like you're no longer just working at general strength. You have a barbell on your back or in your hands. Respect that if you want to get really strong, it's no longer just about intensity. Like you had said, the 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10. I've never seen you write 9 out of 10 on my program, and I'm getting way stronger. And so this is just a really valuable lesson, I think, for people to appreciate. And you also said this, that I just have to I always hammer home, and I always did. Every time I even tell people to do the last set max out, to do that AMRAP, I ask them for a rep in the tank, because if you do an extra, like the only time that I'd say like bench press, if you're getting spotted, odds are pretty low that it's going to hurt you. It's like it can, if I always say, if your form's breaking down, you're compensating, you're not doing the real movement. But most of the time, then you're not going to get trapped in the bar and you get lifted off you. But when it comes to deadlift and like especially squat, I think it's the most dangerous one. If that bar is offline a quarter of an inch the wrong way on one side or the other, you could be out for, like you say, 6 months to a year. And you're no longer progressing, you're actually digressing. And so I actually tell people, it's like, I want a 9 out of 10 RP on your max out set, because just have it in your head, like, I can leave a rep in the tank. Now, this is super contextual, and I just want to make sure people who are listening that we're talking barbell work, right?
Yeah.
When we're talking about like your dumbbell curls, or we're talking about your goblet squats, and you can see this in people who aren't used to it, like you see that metabolic stress, that alone is enough for some people to just try to stimulate. But I think something that's really also helpful for people to appreciate it, and I've just learned this recently, I'm not sure if you've come across this, this is more in relation to hypertrophy, but I think it relates to strength, is effective reps, is to really recognize effective reps as the best way I understand it from mechanical tension in like the most layman simplistic terms is when it starts slowing down. Is if you cannot produce the same force, this is when you're going to have the most mechanical tension on the activating muscle fibers. So if you're first, like, let's say you prescribe a set of 6 in the first 2 or 3, and I feel like that consistent force output, consistent force, but then on rep number 4, it starts slowing down. And usually it's around 5 to 6 effective reps that you get like the best hypertrophy, but that's like a good rep range to start to recognize when you're tapping into your RPE system, right? Because like mathematically, it kind of is hard to say, okay, I want 3 reps and I want 3 reps in the tank. And it's like, so what if you want 2 reps and you want 3 reps in the tank, right? Like, where are these effective reps, right? So it's really challenging, but that's just a little cue. Have you heard the idea of effective reps before, and have you utilized it?
I don't as much, just because most of the people that I work with, the emphasis is strength. There is still obviously like the hypertrophy work in the kind of the off season, but it's less, I guess, not less specific, but the emphasis is more on the strength side of things, and especially on the main lifts. Like, you can, do more of a hypertrophy stimulus on kind of the main lifts, but I still don't go too high, like in terms of rep ranges as well. So it's not as applicable, I guess, to strength. Like you said, it's more like, I guess, more from the hypertrophy side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes sense. So I have to ask this question because we're talking about powerlifting. The old sumo and conventional debate. I just want your 2 cents on it, because you sumo, don't you?
I do both. Yeah. Recently, I've been doing more sumo, and I'll explain why. So there isn't one better than the other. I know people think, sumo is like less range, so it's easier. But funny enough, like, sumo is actually way more technical. It's also different leverages. So regardless of the smaller range, like, you're working different things and with different percentages. So it's not going to be like, oh, a 1-to-1, like less range, then, it's easier. It's not like a bench press where, if you go like wider grip and it's just going to automatically be easier. Like, it's not that. Even though, like, actually some people, like, their closed grip is actually stronger. So, with the sumo and conventional, there's a couple things that I take in consideration when I'm, telling someone to either try this or this. First off, like, obviously, because I'm more from like the physiotherapy side of things as well, are they having issues at all? So for example, this is why I said, like, I do sumo now, is because I was dealing with a back issue, and it made more sense to use sumo at the time, because it's less stress on the back and more on the quads. So for me, that in that specific scenario, it's supposed to be a temporary switch, but I actually liked sumo, so I just kind of stuck with it. But in scenarios like that, where I get a conventional lifter and they're actually having issues, like back issues, we actually switched to sumo temporarily to relieve some of the kind of the stress on the back, and kind of like, so people are aware, like with the sumo, you're more vertical, so there's more pressure kind of on the legs, so you're using more quads compared to like your posterior chain. And that doesn't mean your posterior chain is like out the window, but like it's more percentage on the quads compared to like your posterior chain. In the conventional, you're a bit more over the bar and you're more in a hinge position. So you're actually using more posterior chain compared to your quad. So that's where like, if someone's having issues, like if someone was actually having a quad issue, maybe we'd actually switch them over to like conventional. So that's more from the kind of the rehab or injury kind of perspective. The other main thing is really, what does the person like? Because that will factor in. You know, if someone just really doesn't like the sumo, and I'll say this because this is super important. It's not that they don't like it because they're weaker. So that shouldn't factor in, because it sometimes does take time for things to groove and to actually find that you might actually, it just takes time for your body to adjust, and you might actually find that you're just better in the one that you initially didn't like. So it's not that they like it because they're weaker or stronger. It's actually just, do they prefer this position in general? And alongside that, does their body prefer that position? So sumo requires quite a bit of hip mobility, right? So if the person just doesn't have that mobility, unless they're super adamant on like trying and doing sumo, it's going to take quite a bit of time to like work on that hip mobility until they can actually groove the sumo well. So if someone just doesn't have that mobility, then potentially conventional might just be a better option. Same thing with kind of like I guess it doesn't really factor in too much, but if someone's like really limited in their like ankle mobility, sumo might be a bit better because your shins are a bit more vertical. But then they'd have issues with squats. So that's a whole separate issue. But that's kind of from like that perspective. The other thing is like, what are your actual weaknesses and strength? Like some people are just they've just got like really strong quads. And so sumo might just be a better option for them. Just from like a lifting maximal weight kind of perspective, like that's one aspect. So if someone's like just got a stronger posterior chain, then conventional is definitely going to be better. There is, I guess, like some people out there are saying like, if you've got like longer, arms and like, longer torso and like this, it does potentially, like you can look those up. Like there's a couple, articles out there, and then there's a couple of research papers as well on this. If you're interested in like seeing if there's one kind of like your body proportions, like that one works more. I've just personally, I haven't found that for me or my athletes to be pretty accurate, I would say. Or just hasn't, like, we're a small sample, right? So just, I can't base it off of that, but just personally hasn't worked for me. So I don't really go off of that too much. But definitely if someone's interested in looking that up and trying it out, definitely go for it. And still with the caveat that you want to give something time. So let's say that, your proportions, for example, work better for sumo, and currently you're a conventional lifter. I would say give it at least like, 12 weeks before you decide like, yeah, this just isn't for me, because it does take time for you actually just to adjust to the movement. And then for your body to actually just like work out how it's going to do the movement. So it does take time for things to adjust. So don't like try it one time and you're like, yeah, this is just not for me. What else? There's a bunch of things that kind of factor into this. And then actually, like one of the other ones, and this would be more, I guess, both for competitive powerlifters and then for just general lifters as well, is what are your goals? Like, what are you trying to work on at that point in time? Like, let's say you actually do have strong quads, and you've got like a weak posterior chain, and that's something you actually want to work on or develop, like, whether strength or like hypertrophy standpoint. Then maybe doing conventional, like if you're a sumo lifter, maybe doing conventional for some time to strengthen that out. And actually in my training, like I do both conventional and sumo, especially in the earlier phases or off season. As you get closer, obviously, to competition, you want to be very specific and get to your main comp lifts. But in the off season, like if you have weaknesses, then definitely work on those, right? Because it's going to transfer over. They're very similar movements. So they definitely transfer over to each other, especially if you have like a specific weakness that you're working on.
Yeah, well stated. Very, very in-depth answer. I really appreciate that. And I like that you're kind of giving lens and context to all of them. One of the things that I had someone point out to me was actually, like you had said, how people can be just set different for it. And a colleague of mine had pointed out that you just have these archetypes, like the way that your bones and your hips are structured. Like you have kind of these, you can almost think of like a triangle upside down with like or like the other way. So your base is wide, and I'm more of a wide base. That's the sumo stance. But then you have the other archetype, which is like an upside down triangle where you actually have narrow hips. And so like a conventional just makes sense for a force production standpoint, because that's how your hips are set up. And that's exactly what you end up seeing with it. Like, I mean, not exactly, but that's what I have seen. And so, like you said, like there's also just the context of like, yeah, you can't do one workout with it. Like, give it 3 months and understand that there's a whole different. Like, I just did sumo and I just treated it like a hip hinge, and then like it was stronger. But then you completely broke down my form. It's like, no, you're not using your legs at all here. It's like, no, I'm not. And so it's definitely completely giving me better context to how different of a lift it is. And it actually became less easy because I wasn't just muscling through my posterior chain. I'm actually trying to get better leg drive from it. So really valuable context there. I wanted to kind of switch gears here because you also have great knowledge around the physical therapy, and it's such a unique twist to have someone who's both like able to be a strength coach for this very specific and high level skill, and then also being able to help with the injury prevention. So I'm really curious from your perspective, just from like, because most people listening is going to be like kind of more gen pop powerlifters, not necessarily competitive. What are some like what are some of your best like things that you would want people to recognize or recommend people recognize in order to consider, let's start with injury prevention itself.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like I'll start off with like the main thing that I see people get hurt for. And it's a general statement, so you just kind of you'd have to factor into like whatever you're doing, but just people doing way too much way too soon is really the biggest reason I see people, and this is very specific to powerlifting because it's not a dynamic sport, right? Like you're stuck in your place, you're up and down, right? So there's only so much that can happen, and yes, freak accidents do happen with powerlifting, but really the main thing that I see people for is that they just did way too much way too soon. And when I say that, it's not just like, and I think this is just a general theme that everyone needs to understand. Whenever we're talking about stress on the body, it doesn't purely mean just training. It means everything that's factored into your life.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So it's everything that's factoring into your life, right? So whether it's like the amount of sleep that you're getting, the food that you're eating, the hydration, like everything factors in here. So if you just have very shitty, and I'll start off with like I guess just the main thing. Let's say you're doing great on everything else in your life, and we're just purely talking about your training right now. People either get online programs that are just not meant for them, like, right? They're just templates, right? They're not meant for anyone in particular. So if you're someone that just doesn't tolerate volume too well, or you're just a beginner or whatever, like this program just is too much for you, and you go and do it, you're gonna get injured. If your body's not able to recover from something and you're just constantly putting more stress and stress, you're gonna get injured. If beginners in general, like if they do anything, if they get into the gym and just look at a weight, they're gonna get stronger. So that's why, like, regardless of the program you go with, you're gonna see changes. But for a beginner, you don't want to jump in, do a program that just like isn't meant, first of all, either for beginners, or sometimes there are beginner templates out there that I'm like, this is not a beginner, like this is not a beginner level. And they're just doing way too much for whatever they can recover from. Now factor into that someone who, is, out drinking on the weekends, all weekend, they've got shitty sleep throughout the week, got a lot of work stress, their nutrition is very off. You can imagine how now, not only is the stress coming in is too much from training, now you've got all this added stress that's just like making things amplified, right? But it still comes back to the same concept of doing too much too soon, or adding in too much stress too soon. And so one thing that I say with like beginners, and I actually think like beginners are the best people to have coaches, not just from like the I guess technique standpoint of things, but because like even though like anything can work for them, a lot also might be too much that it actually just like makes things worse. So yeah, they'll see the gains, but then they'll see the injuries as well. And so, I always say with beginners, like, don't just like get a random, unless you have some background in strength training, in rehab or whatever, don't just like go online and just get a random program and just start. The other side of things, actually, and this is not injury related per se, but the other side of things is like some beginners like just assume because they're beginners they can't do much, and then they just end up like missing out on way too many gains, right? So you've got like the two spectrums, but that's one thing that I will say that definitely for sure, like that's one of the main things that I see people get injured for, and I think like too many people are, I guess, focused on the effects of mechanics on injury, and mechanics on pain. And definitely not to say that, just go out and do shitty form. Like, that's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is form doesn't have to be 100% for you to be able to stay out of pain, out of injury. And what I go off of is more principles. Like I said, we've got principles, and then we've got, ideas that we attribute things to. So you can have a bunch of people, and we kind of talked about this on one of our calls, is like a lot of people have some knee values, right? So when we're too focused on these mechanical aspects, unless, like I said, like unless it's like you look at it, it's like, no, like this looks horrible. Unless you get that kind of vomit kind of test out of it, and which I have. Like people, when I say this stuff, like people, yeah, just go out and do a shitty form. No, I've corrected a lot of people on this, because like you just look at it and it just looks horrible. You're like, no, like this is definitely just too much. But like if someone's like having like a couple degrees of knee valgus, it's not like, we know from research that that's not correlated to to having injuries or pain. Similarly with like some low back rounding, right? So those things, and I think, and why I say this is not for people to go out and just not care about form, but it's more so for the people that are overly concerned with form, that it actually derails their progress. And I have worked with some of people like that, where they're actually too stuck up on like getting 100% form every rep, that they actually just don't increase the weight at all. They keep going, regressing, because they're so afraid that if they like just come off like 1 degree or like, something, that they're just going to blow up their back or like blow out their knee or whatever. Right. So those are the people that I'm addressing here, is like the people that are so afraid of like straying off of that 100% form, that they actually don't do much, because, you add some weight, you add some like progression, and then they're just like over analyzing their movement, looking for those like minor things that are happening, and then they just don't progress for a very long time. So those are more the people that I'm addressing, but definitely, again, just to restate this like for the millionth time, this doesn't mean you can go out and do shitty form. That's not what I'm saying here. Yeah, so that is in a nutshell, kind of like, if we were to like really kind of just give like a very quick overview on why people get injured, I would say people doing too much too soon.
Totally agree. I really think it's, especially when you're talking about people who are trying to do barbell work, right? Because you're clearly an ambitious person that's like, hey, I want to get strong as possible. You're inspired by the powerlifters and bodybuilders, like, yeah, it's a barbell, and then from there it's like, because you're now, it's an ego thing, right? Because you're building up your ego. So it's how many guys you see do like bench press and it's not even halfway down, and how many guys you see even if they're doing curls and their elbows never extend. And, I think I had this guy approach me who, he was a very nice gentleman. He was a leaner guy, and he's like, hey, you're really big, man. I was just curious, how do you get big like that? I'm like, hey, you know what, dude, portion of this is genetics. Like I was naturally a thicker kid, but I always lifted. And the simplest piece of advice I told him was like, just, don't get hurt. It's like you have to keep doing this for a very long time. And the number one thing is don't get hurt. And then, of course, I see him doing these 45s that he can't handle in his curls.
Yep.
But and then at the other end of the spectrum that you had mentioned, and I think I'm falling into that, but it's because of injuries. So, like I'll watch someone do a back squat, and I'm thinking like, and honestly, it's just like, it's like past trauma, when it's like you have one bad squat. I remember I had one last year where I was like, I just couldn't finish my workout after. Luckily, it was just a strain and it didn't, I couldn't even feel it the next day. Walked away from the workout, which I think was smart. But then that made me fearful of like, okay, there's too much hip hinge in my squat. And then I'm watching some of these people doing like some of these low, heavy squats. And I'm like, oh, okay, they got it. And they do another one, like, oh, no, again. You do it again. And I'm like, oh, they can do that. And it's like, yeah, your body can tolerate some stress. And so I think like I get into this kind of mechanical obsession because of injury, but it doesn't mean that's why the injury happened, right? So I think it's an important context to have for yourself. And I mean, like, if you're not worried about it, then that can be a problem. It goes to that 80-20 or 90-10 principle. Same thing with nutrition. It's like, you can have junk food, you can have junk reps. And as a matter of fact, when I have novices, I even like, that's why I like the online training format. I'm like, 80% of what you're doing is just fine. And if I'm there in person, I'll make it a little bit harder and a little bit better about 10 to 20% of the time. The only time that like you really need a bit more skill and development is when it's like, okay, powerlifting and you don't actually have a lot of skill in it. Like when you have very little understanding, but like most of it's fine. And it's like, you even kind of can put in some not so great reps. Boxing's the same way. I remember this one boxing coaching clinic I took, and this guy's like, make sure they have 100% good form. I'm like, that's not possible. I'm just like, that's just, you're not. Like, if anything, I tell them, punch out your bad form, because your body's going to has to become more efficient on it. But no, I think that's really good. And I think that's really helpful for people to appreciate that there's going to be spectrums. You got to find yourself in between. It doesn't give you, there's no one size fits all, but to have the context of both. Now, what I'd like to finish up with here is a bit more coming back to your story where you're looking at right now. One of the things I wish I would have asked earlier, and this is actually relevant to right now. So just asking you, where are your lifts currently at? And where you're hoping to bring them, as you had talked about, you're looking at something in the future here. So where are your lifts currently at, and where are you hoping to put them for your competition?
So currently, like it's hard to give you a number because I haven't gone too heavy in a while because of the back injury that I had, and now I'm in prep, kind of off season, so I don't have like any specific numbers. But the most that I've hit, I guess, for deadlifts, 465, for squats, 380, and then for bench press, 285.
Okay, and at what weight?
What do you mean?
How much did you weigh? Sorry.
Oh, at that point, I was in between the 63 and 72. So probably around like 65, 66 kilos.
Yeah, super impressive. Like that, I know so many adult males that they would dream of that weight. So I think it's super valuable for people to have that context. And where are you hoping to end up with some of your lifts this year, where you're projecting? Because I know with this, when you're a competitive powerlifter, your plan is, this is my event. we're going to build this up to here, and we don't need to hit any PRs any sooner than that?
I mean, because I did have that drop in like in body weight. So for context there, so and these are like this is, I guess, the most recent numbers that I do remember. So 455, I have hit at a 63 kilo body weight for deadlifts. For squats, the most that I've hit at this body weight so far, like the 63, is I believe 355. And then for bench, it's 265. So what I'm hoping, like, I basically went from like weighing 75 kilos, 75 kilos to 63 kilos. So a 12 kilo drop. So like, basically I'm just hoping to like hit the same numbers that I hit before at this like lower body weight. And then like, because my deadlift is already up there, like I would like to like PR that, potentially like 475. But yeah, those are the goals.
Well, there's nothing wrong with those. Yeah. And that's super important for people to take into context that the weight super matters. Like, it's just your muscle mass, your energy, everything. So super pumped for that. When's the competition for that?
So nationals is, I think mid-February of 2023.
Okay. All right. It's not too far away. That's exciting. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to have you on again. We can nerd out about this stuff a ton. So I'm definitely going to reach out to you again in the future. And, I appreciate your time. Why don't you let the listeners know where they can find more about you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my Instagram is phoenix.reborn.nada, and Phoenix Reborn is just my company name. Yeah, that's typically where you'll find me.
Awesome. Rise of the Phoenix, right? From the engine. I love that. Okay. Thank you so much, Nada. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nada, for that. I honestly learned so much from working with her, and even within this, she gave more context, breaking down the RPE system and really appreciating that is super relative day to day. The stresses that your body and your system takes, your 3 rep, 1 rep, whatever, it's not continuous. It is ever flowing. You're going to have your best days and some bad days. And so it's super important for people to appreciate that and to take that into context. And that's why I really am starting to evolve more into an RPE system with more and more of my clients. And it's good to leave reps in the tank, because then you can understand where you're at and you can actually control your intensities and be more intentful for your strength training. I could have asked her 100 more questions, but I wanted to kind of cover the basis of a few really important ones around the RP that she educated me on, and around the sumo and conventional. She also educated me a ton on, and also just those contexts of physical therapy from one end to the other. And as I'd even said, like, I'm definitely on the more too worried about form at times kind of context, but you got to put yourself on a spectrum. It's never one or the other. You understand that you don't want to fall at one end or the other, but to try to find the in between. But it's super helpful, I think, for any, aspiring powerlifter or someone who just wants to be a barbell bro or gal, to utilize those strategies, understand that RPE is a thing and that it's related to your percentage, but RPE, rate of perceived exertion, is a really good way to rate how hard you're going and to play with it based on your training cycle. Play with it earlier in your cycle versus later in your cycle, and to know deloads, and to record those weights and what they feel like. And then it's super helpful to appreciate the nuanced details of sumo versus conventional, and definitely all the context that she gave us on the physical therapy side of things, where going too hard too soon is super dangerous, and then not being afraid to go hard is just not super helpful if you're trying to hit PRs. So to give yourself a little bit of leeway, again, context matters. Know where you fall on the spectrum. That's kind of for you, or to, as she had said, getting a coach helps, and it helped me a lot too. I've been doing, I've been the barbell bro for a while, but a strength coach for a long time, and to have someone coach me on, improve this, utilize this, stay at this intensity, and to be told what to do, it's so helpful. I always tell people, if you could go on YouTube and learn anything, but do you really know it? And do you trust yourself to do it? When if it's in the context of, well, I have a sound in my engine in your car. Now, if you're not already mechanically inclined, you could say, hey, I hear the sound in my car. And you look it up and, take apart this part, you replace your radiator or whatever. Anything you could do on YouTube. But would you do it? Like, would you trust yourself to do it if you have no former, mechanical inclination? You haven't done this? No, you go pay a mechanic to do it. Or at very least, if you really want to learn it, then have them teach you. But my whole point there is there are trades for a reason. We can tend to take pride or have an ego going into the gym. But being humble is something that I'll always appreciate. I wish I did it sooner in my career. I wish I had coaches sooner in my career. So whether it's reaching out to Nada or myself or just someone that you trust that has good experience, it's worth its weight in gold. And you can prevent injuries, plus you can get gains sooner. So I can't recommend it enough. Coaching makes things easier. So really appreciate you listening today. I hope you learned a lot. Remember to remember to leave a 5-star review. Remember to subscribe if you're on YouTube, and share these episodes with anyone that might find this interesting, because that's how I get to help and support more people. And that's how this podcast keeps its momentum going. So thank you so much. I hope you learned a lot. I hope this helps you with your training and you can take these lessons forward, because I want you to live that ambitious life. Because it is not about the pursuit of happiness. It's about the happiness within your pursuit. And I will catch you next time.